Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are talking about the government. Yay!
I'm not sure that is like what people want to hear.
No, it's not what people want to hear. But that's one of the blessings of going chapter by chapter through the entire Bible. Today we're looking at Romans 13. And I think Romans 13 is an excellent chapter if you want a pointed directive on how we handle government, what the role of government is, and just what we're supposed to do about it. We talked yesterday about how this is a pivot. Romans 12 is a pivot into like this part of the book that is focused on right living. So we've talked about right believing, right doctrine. Now we're talking about right practice. So it's very, I think, appropriate that Paul spends some time talking to the Jews and Gentiles in Rome how to deal with the authorities, with the government in Rome. Obviously, part of our lived out Christian experience continues to be how we handle government, how we handle civil responsibility, and this chapter is very important to those topics.
Yeah, and I think this chapter, although very short, I feel like it has a lot just packed into it verse by verse. There are many different commands of essentially how to live, and I will not claim to be an expert on any of these things. However, I do have questions that I don't know that we'll necessarily find the answers to either, but a lot of these things are, I don't know, definitely things that still cross our paths today, especially with authorities, and even just with how we live our lives day to day interacting with other people.
I don't know if anybody wants to revisit this period in time, but I think I read and heard other people read Romans 13 the most in 2020 because it was all about like, do we have to follow these mandates and do we have to follow these new rules and laws, and how do we handle expectations from the government? How do we handle expectations from God? So we're going to dig into that. I am curious, like, what are the questions? You said you have a lot of questions. What are some of the questions you have?
I guess maybe not necessarily like questions, but just like, that's an interesting thought. So I guess like the whole idea of being subject to government or governing authorities. I oftentimes, I feel like you can take like a really hard stance on this if you're trying to like make a point about governing officials or yada yada. I don't know, oftentimes, and please, like, if you are a governing official, don't like hear me as I don't appreciate you, but I would often get like kind of like weird vibes when I was in church and was like, we're gonna pray for all of our leaders, and we're gonna pray that for the office of whatever, and we're gonna pray that they are, you know, following God's leading, and all those things are true, but it's always just like, I just don't feel like I trust these people at all. And so for me, it's kind of like, it's kind of goofy, but at the same time in here, it is talking about like, you know, we should be at least thankful. What was it? What was the verse that I told you? It's the first verse, actually. Our study Bible says that God gives authorities as a blessing, and sometimes he allows evil rulers to bring trial and judgment. So like my, I guess, annoyance, maybe not annoyance, but just like uneasy feelings about it is like, am I going to just take that up with God's sovereignty? I don't know. Because that seems a little off.
So a couple statements and then some real world observations I've made. Romans 13:1 is very clear. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. We've talked about God's sovereignty. We've talked about how God has chosen how things will play out, who will be an authority. Really, there's really no question of that. If you look at like different rulers, even throughout the Old Testament, where it says that God raised them up. Sometimes God raised up godly leaders to lead Israel. He raised up judges to care for Israel. Other times he raised up evil, wicked kings to judge Israel. So there's a case to be made from Scripture that God puts wise, godly kings in place, and other times he actually puts in ungodly kings in place. And Paul's saying, hey, all authority comes from God. If there is a ruler over you, he has been put over you by God. There was not, I don't think, actually, you know what? Well, somebody can correct me live in the comments. I would say we live in a unique age where every single person, at least in the United States, I know not all of you are in the United States, but many other countries around the world, where we feel like we have a say in who our governing authorities are. That is a relatively modern development. So it was much easier to just believe that God had instituted authorities in the past because nobody had a say in it. Now we at least feel like we have a say in it. I think there's obviously many layers to that depending on what nation, what country, what ruler you have. But even so, even feeling like we have a say in it, God would still ordain those things. Like God didn't just all of a sudden be like, well, there's now representative republics, so I don't need to lead people anymore.
Yeah.
With that, people would have understood like, hey, there's good rulers and there's bad rulers. And a lot of the Roman rulers were actually very bad rulers. But Paul here is still saying, hey, be subject to your governing authorities because God has put them in place. And there's some pretty prominent ones like, God raised up every single judge. God raised up Nebuchadnezzar. God raised up Cyrus. God raised up like good kings, bad kings, whatever. I've made that point enough now.
I think it kind of coincides with yesterday as well when we were talking about just like honoring others, even if they are, I guess, what did we say yesterday? Like honoring people regardless of how 100%. You feel. But I think that even it's more prominent in this chapter where it's talking about like governing authorities or people with authority over you. And that can be a very, very hard thing to do.
Well, and you were talking about how sometimes you get nervous about churches praying for leadership. One, that's not good. Like we should pray for our leaders. We should pray for good kings and we should pray for our wicked kings.
I think it definitely stems though from like even just like foundational things that I'm like, I don't line up with you there, so I am not about to be like, yes,
well,
God
we're even supposed to pray for our enemies and those that persecute us, so we are supposed to pray for people that don't line up with us. Mm-hmm. The thing that gets weird in churches, I think, and it's not this way in every church, but we have noticed at times in churches, we don't pray for leaders at all until it's like October before an election or November before an election. And that's when it's a little bit strange. Like, like as a church family, we've never been passionate about praying for our leaders except for right now. That seems strange. So I do think we should be concerned for and praying for our leaders at all times, not just during elections. And also, please hear me. I know that not everybody lives in the United States. We understand there are different governments and different ways that they work out there. But Romans 13 is clear. Listen to your leaders and be subject to your authorities. The unique thing to consider about this topic is that Paul ends up in prison. And so obviously he doesn't mean obey them no matter what they say, no matter when they say it, because Paul himself ended up being disobedient to his governing authorities and ultimately was executed by the governing authorities. So there must be obviously some kind of division here where Christians aren't called to just do everything the government says always. So the hitch or the trick or the discernment and wisdom comes, how do we figure that out?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to even try to answer that.
No? But you're not going to take a shot at that?
Nope. But, I mean, do you want to speak more to this authorities?
I think there's a clear way that authority works. We are citizens first and foremost of God's kingdom. And so we are loyal to and we are obedient to, first and foremost, God's kingdom. Then God has all of us living in different communities, in different nations, in different cultures. We are called to represent God uniquely in those communities and cultures. So yes, we should obey our ruling authorities because God has put them in place to watch out for us and take care of us. The hitch is whenever our ruling authorities are calling us to do things that are directly disobedient to God.
Right.
So you think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're like, no, we're not going to bow down and worship the idols. We refuse to do that. You think about Daniel. He's like, no, I'm not going to pray to the king. I'm going to pray to God. So there are times where we don't just do what the government says because what the government says is against God's will. And there is a ton of wisdom and discernment that is required there. One thing that is worth noting is that the Romans were not godly people. They were not godly kings. And Jesus encourages people to pay their taxes, and Paul encourages people to obey their authorities. So there is some level of, hey, this is the culture I live in. These are the people I'm going to honor, even when they're not godly. Should we desire that they are godly? 100%. Why would we not want godly leaders? It's not a good thing for a nation to live under ungodly leaders, and it's not a scandalous thing for Christians to desire Christian leaders, because we have a loyalty to God's kingdom first and a loyalty to our own culture and communities second.
So the next part of this very short chapter feels like we dumped a ton of time into the beginning.
That government thing is a big deal. Yeah.
So the next part is literally just, it reminds me a lot of the Ten Commandments, and then the wrapped in little part that Jesus adds in the New Testament. We've heard this before. So I think what really sticks out to me is just in verse 9. Towards the end, any other commandment is summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there's this whole list of things before that of how to essentially have right living with one another, in a Christian godly way, probably just to avoid some of these things that will hold us back.
Yeah, for sure.
So for me, it's really encouraging because it's all right, if I owe someone something, there's always tension in that. If you've ever owed anybody anything, there's tension for the person that you owe something to. There's tension for you as an individual. I mean, college debt has been a big deal for us. And that is just you can feel the tension of it. It exists, and it's I hate it.
Actually,
or even
for
just
us was an unwise decision that we are now trying to deal with.
Yeah. So, and then like I said, it goes through all of the other commandments that we would have known from the past. No murdering, don't steal, don't covet. And essentially just if you are loving your neighbor the same way that you would hope someone would love you, those things don't have any place. I don't want anyone to steal from me. I don't want anyone to owe me anything. You know what I mean? I don't want to live in the tension of that sin. So it just kind of lays out those very, I would say, foundational things. But then it also goes into this little 4-verse chunk of information about just how, again, I guess taking it even a step further of how to live without any of those other tensions. I don't know. You want to add to that at all?
Well, he is making an argument that Jesus has made. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount highlights these commandments that people are familiar with, but then talks about how there's a deeper level to these things. When you love your neighbor, you care for them. So it's one thing to follow the law. It's another thing to actually be on the inside obedient to Christ and not just outwardly obedient. I hope that makes sense. I feel I'm not making as much sense as I would like to. But Paul's saying the same thing. Hey, love covers a multitude of sins. Love one another. And when you love one another, you are fulfilling the law. So it's hey, let's actually look out for each other. Let's care for each other.
Right.
Don't let this get hijacked and become just love people no matter what they do and accept whatever they do. And, everything's fine. That's not what this is talking about either. I
mean, it definitely clears that up in several verses after of
exactly.
Other things.
It talks about don't walk in darkness.
Right.
And that's a real challenge in our world today, that a lot of times darkness is held up as though it is love. And that's just not true. It's not accurate. The Bible teaches that that's not accurate. This is Christian love, where we are caring for each other, honoring each other, supporting each other. And you have to understand Romans 13 in light of, I would say, at least Romans 12, but also the whole book. Paul has already laid out what love is. And so he's saying love one another in the context of what he's already established in the book.
So I would say a good verse for today, for your part, is verse 12. So chapter 13, verse 12 says, "The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the work of darkness and put on the armor of light." And I think that sums up this chapter really well, because there's this period now where Jesus has set the tone for us, and we're out of the darkness. The day is here. Make use of this time until Jesus returns to live in this community of faith without those tensions we were talking about, and respect the authorities that God has put in place, all necessarily just for God's glory, but also understanding that God's plan and promises are much bigger than ours. So I think that this is a good prompting to us. Live a life that is reflective of these things, as well as respecting the authorities that are over you, although that might not always be the most fun thing to do. But hopefully this verse is encouraging to you today as we wrap up chapter 13. We'll be back again next week on Monday for Romans chapter 14. Thanks for joining with us today. Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
Romans chapter 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything, except to love each other. For the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.